America's geography just got a whole lot weirder in 2025. While most people think they know the basics about US territories, recent surveys and population updates have revealed some absolutely mind-bending facts that will make you question everything you thought you knew about our borders. Take a piece of one state that requires driving through another country just to reach it, or a town that exists in complete defiance of basic geography, or the state that sits closest to Africa in a way that will shock you. These 25 geographic oddities have become even more bizarre with the latest data, featuring populations you won't believe and boundaries that defy all logic. Minnesota's forgotten corner gets even stranger. Picture this. You want to visit a piece of Minnesota, but first you have to drive through Canada to get there. The Northwest Angle represents one of America's strangest territorial situations, and the latest 2025 data shows this geographic oddity has become even more bizarre than anyone imagined. The population shifts since 2020 tell a remarkable story of isolation. What started as a community already hanging by a thread has experienced dramatic changes that reflect the unique challenges of living in America's most disconnected territory. This sparsely inhabited exclave continues to face the mounting pressures of maintaining a viable community in such a remote location. Climate change has dramatically altered the water levels around Lake of the Woods, affecting both the practical and legal aspects of this territorial anomaly. Lower water levels have exposed previously submerged land, creating new questions about exactly where Minnesota's boundaries actually lie. The changing shoreline has forced residents to adapt their daily routines and has complicated everything from boat launches to property assessments. Advanced GPS technology has produced a stunning revelation about the Northwest Angle's actual size. Precision measurements completed in 2025 show the area encompasses 2.3 square miles more territory than previous calculations indicated. This discovery has triggered new boundary surveys and raised questions about tax assessments, voting districts, and resource management that had been based on outdated measurements for decades. New fishing regulations have created additional layers of jurisdictional confusion that would challenge even the most experienced legal minds. Anglers now must navigate rules from Minnesota, Canada, and federal authorities, with different seasons, licenses, and catch limits depending on which side of invisible water boundaries they happen to cast their lines. The area's unique regulatory status has attracted cryptocurrency miners seeking to exploit potential loopholes in oversight. These operations have strained the limited electrical infrastructure while creating new questions about taxation and regulatory authority in a place where jurisdiction was already complicated. Legal battles over internet service provision have intensified the digital divide affecting residents. Competing claims over which country should provide service, combined with the physical challenges of running cables across international waters, have left many residents with connectivity that would have been considered inadequate decades ago. This digital isolation has transformed the Northwest Angle into a place where 21st century technology struggles to reach 19th century boundaries. But Minnesota's border confusion is just the beginning. Rivers have created their own share of territorial puzzles across America, sometimes trapping entire communities on the wrong side of state lines. The Iowa town that defies geography. Carter Lake presents one of these river-created puzzles in its most extreme form. Looking at a map, you'd naturally assume Carter Lake sits in Nebraska, given how it's completely surrounded by Cornhusker State territory. The visual makes no sense until you realize this Iowa town represents one of America's most confusing geographic situations, where a river literally moved an entire community from one state to another. The Missouri River's dramatic course change in 1977 created this geographic anomaly when flooding shifted the river 1.25 miles to the southeast. What had been Iowa territory on the west bank suddenly found itself surrounded by Nebraska, creating an exclave that defies conventional understanding of state boundaries. This single flood event transformed Carter Lake from a typical border town into America's most geographically isolated municipal government. Infrastructure demands have forced Carter Lake to navigate challenges that no other American city faces. Water lines, electrical grids, and telecommunications networks must cross state boundaries to serve Iowa residents living in Nebraska territory. The town requires special interstate agreements for basic utility maintenance, creating bureaucratic complications that can delay essential repairs for weeks. Emergency services. Coordination has evolved into a complex operation requiring constant communication between Iowa and Nebraska dispatch centers. Fire trucks from Nebraska might arrive first at Iowa emergencies, while Iowa ambulances must navigate Nebraska traffic laws to reach their own residents. These arrangements require both states to maintain specialized protocols for cross-border emergency response. Tax implications have transformed Carter Lake into an unexpected business destination. Companies discovered they can benefit from Iowa's corporate tax structure while operating in what appears to be Nebraska territory. This has attracted businesses seeking regulatory advantages, bringing new commercial development that further complicates the jurisdictional maze. The Missouri River continues shifting course, requiring constant boundary surveys to determine exactly where Iowa ends and Nebraska begins. Recent surveys have revealed additional territorial complications as the river creates new channels and abandons old ones, potentially affecting property ownership and tax assessments throughout the area. The 1972 Supreme Court case affirmed Iowa's jurisdiction over Carter Lake, establishing precedents for how river-created enclaves exercise municipal authority across state lines. Modern GPS technology has uncovered previously unknown territorial complications, including properties that exist partially in both states and utility easements that cross multiple jurisdictions. Carter Lake continues challenging state jurisdiction concepts, proving that natural disasters can create administrative puzzles that persist for generations. But rivers aren't the only geographic features that create surprising territorial relationships across vast distances. The African distance that shocks Americans. Which U.S. state sits closest to Africa? Most Americans would immediately point to Florida, reasoning that its southern position and tropical climate make it the obvious choice. The assumption seems logical when you consider Florida's location jutting into the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by warm waters that mirror African coastal conditions. This geographic assumption crumbles when you examine the actual measurements. Maine holds the distinction of being America's closest point to Africa, specifically at Quoddy Head Peninsula. The counterintuitive reality challenges everything most people believe about American geography and continental relationships. Quoddy Head sits exactly 3,154 miles from El Bedoua, a rural commune in Morocco, making Maine's easternmost point significantly closer to Africa than any Florida location. These precise 2025 measurements represent the most accurate distance calculations ever recorded between the two continents, thanks to advanced satellite positioning technology that has refined geographic data to unprecedented levels of precision. The new satellite positioning systems have eliminated previous measurement uncertainties, providing data accurate to within inches rather than miles. These technological improvements have revealed that earlier distance estimates contained significant errors, with some calculations off by hundreds of miles. The refined measurements now serve as the definitive standard for intercontinental distance planning. Maine's tourism industry has embraced this unexpected geographic connection, developing marketing campaigns that highlight the state's unique African proximity. Visitors now travel specifically to experience standing at America's closest point to Africa, creating new tourism revenue streams for communities along the eastern coast. Cultural exchange programs have flourished based on this geographic reality, connecting Maine communities with Moroccan counterparts across the Atlantic. Educational institutions have established student exchange programs, while artists collaborate on projects that celebrate the unexpected continental connection. These initiatives demonstrate how geographic facts can foster international relationships. The lighthouse at Quoddy Head has become a symbolic bridge between continents, representing the geographic reality that continues to astound visitors. The structure serves as a tangible reminder of America's unexpected proximity to Africa, with thousands of tourists annually making pilgrimages to witness this geographic phenomenon firsthand. This geographic reality persistently surprises both visitors and Maine residents, challenging preconceived notions about continental relationships. The fact that you can stand in Maine and be closer to Africa than someone standing in Miami continues to reshape how Americans understand their country's place in global geography. But distance isn't the only geographic factor that creates confusion across American territories. Alaska's time zone chaos reaches new heights. Alaska's enormous landmass creates time-keeping challenges that would make even the most organized scheduler throw up their hands in frustration. The state stretches across such a vast distance that it technically spans 4 different time zones, yet Alaska operates under just one official time designation. This means residents in the westernmost Aleutian Islands experience sunrise and sunset hours that differ dramatically from those living in the state's eastern regions. The state technically covers territory that should fall under Pacific, Alaska, Hawaii Aleutian, and Samoa time zones based on longitude calculations. However, Alaska Standard Time governs the entire state, creating situations where some communities experience noon, while the sun position suggests it should be 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. This temporal mismatch affects everything from business operations to basic daily routines. Legislative proposals introduced in 2024 aim to address these timing complications by potentially splitting Alaska into multiple time zones. State lawmakers recognized that the current single-zone system creates significant coordination problems for businesses, government agencies, and residents trying to manage schedules across the state's massive territory. These proposals reflect growing recognition that Alaska's geographic reality requires more nuanced time management approaches. Remote communities have developed their own unofficial time systems to accommodate their unique circumstances and natural rhythms. Many villages operate according to local sunrise and sunset patterns rather than official clock times, creating informal scheduling systems that align with seasonal daylight changes. These localized practices often conflict with official time requirements for government services, business operations, and digital communications. Economic impact studies completed in 2025 revealed that Alaska's time zone confusion results in billions of dollars in lost productivity annually. These losses stem from scheduling difficulties, communication breakdowns, missed appointments, and coordination problems between different regions of the state. Businesses struggle to maintain efficient operations when different locations experience dramatically different daylight patterns while operating under identical official time. The aviation industry faces significant operational struggles with Alaska's time zone anomalies. Flight scheduling, air traffic control coordination, and maintenance operations require precise timing. But the state's single time zone system creates logistical complications that can affect safety and efficiency. Pilots must constantly calculate actual local time versus official time when planning flights and coordinating with ground operations. A federal review of Alaska's time zone designation continues examining potential solutions to address these widespread temporal complications. But Alaska's timing confusion represents just one example of how official designations can diverge from geographic reality, creating situations where even the most famous landmarks might not be exactly where people think they are. Four Corners Monument's shocking inaccuracy. The Four Corners Monument stands as perhaps the most photographed geographic mistake in America. The iconic image shows tourists stretching their limbs across state lines, placing hands and feet in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah simultaneously. This famous landmark attracts millions of visitors who pose for pictures believing they stand at the precise intersection of 4 state boundaries. The 2025 GPS measurements reveal a stunning truth that challenges this beloved tourist tradition. Advanced satellite positioning technology shows the monument sits 1,807 feet away from the actual Four Corners point. This distance means visitors have been celebrating their multi-state experience at a location that misses the true boundary intersection by more than 1/3 of a mile. The discovery emerged through advanced satellite positioning technology that provides accuracy measurements within inches rather than the feet or yards of previous surveying methods. These sophisticated GPS systems can pinpoint locations with unprecedented precision, revealing discrepancies that earlier surveying equipment could never detect. The technology has revolutionized boundary determination, exposing errors that existed for decades without detection. Moving this famous landmark presents a bureaucratic nightmare involving multiple state governments, federal agencies, and tribal authorities. The relocation would require approvals from Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, each with different legal procedures and requirements. The monuments establish tourist infrastructure, including parking areas, visitor facilities, and access roads, would need complete reconstruction at enormous expense. Visitor numbers have increased since the inaccuracy became public knowledge. The publicity surrounding the monument's incorrect placement has created additional tourist interest, with visitors arriving specifically to experience this famous geographic mistake. The controversy has transformed the site from a simple boundary marker into a curiosity that attracts geography enthusiasts seeking unusual travel experiences. Legal implications extend beyond simple boundary marking to questions of jurisdictional authority and property rights. The incorrect placement creates potential complications for law enforcement, taxation, and regulatory oversight in the surrounding area. Historical agreements and legal surveys define actual boundaries, but the monument's symbolic importance has created confusion about where state authority begins and ends. The tourism industry has embraced the controversy by marketing the monument as a unique destination where visitors can experience a famous geographic era. But while the Four Corners Monument represents confusion created by surveying limitations, other American communities face geographic isolation that creates far more serious consequences for residents trying to maintain connections with their own country. Point Roberts, pandemic-era isolation. Point Roberts represents an American town that exists in geographic limbo, accessible by land exclusively through Canada. This Washington state community sits on a peninsula that extends south from British Columbia, creating a situation where residents must cross international borders just to reach the rest of their own country. COVID-19 border closures transformed Point Roberts into one of America's most isolated communities practically overnight. The pandemic restrictions created unprecedented isolation that went far beyond typical small-town remoteness. Residents found themselves cut off from essential services, medical care, and basic supplies that required travel through Canada to access. The border closures highlighted just how dependent this American community had become on international transit for survival. The 2025 population count reveals the devastating impact of this isolation, with residents facing challenges that forced many to relocate permanently. The population drop reflects residents' inability to maintain normal lives when accessing the rest of America became nearly impossible. Families discovered that routine activities like medical appointments, grocery shopping, and visiting relatives required navigating complex international protocols. Border crossing procedures implemented since the pandemic have made access significantly more complicated than before. These new protocols require additional documentation, extended processing times, and enhanced security screenings that can turn routine trips into hours-long ordeals. The increased bureaucracy has created barriers that many residents simply cannot navigate regularly. Residents now require special documentation packages just to reach the rest of America, including enhanced identification, proof of residence, and sometimes advance approval for border crossings. These requirements have transformed what should be domestic travel into an international expedition, requiring planning and paperwork. The economic devastation caused by restricted Canadian transit has been catastrophic for local businesses. Restaurants, shops, and service providers that relied on Canadian customers and American visitors have closed permanently. The tourism industry, which formed a significant portion of the local economy, essentially disappeared when border crossings became prohibitively difficult. Property values have plummeted due to access restrictions, with homes selling for fractions of their pre-pandemic values. The combination of isolation and economic uncertainty has made Point Roberts property essentially unmarketable to outside buyers. Ongoing diplomatic negotiations continue seeking solutions to ease transit restrictions while maintaining security requirements. Point Roberts has become a powerful symbol of how border policies can create unintended consequences for American communities. But while modern politics created Point Roberts' current struggles, some American boundary disputes trace back to decisions made centuries ago by colonial authorities who drew lines that continue creating legal complications today. Delaware's perfectly round border mystery. Delaware's northern boundary represents one of America's most unusual state borders, forming a perfect circle with a 12-mile radius centered on the courthouse in New Castle. This geometric marvel stands out dramatically when you examine state boundary maps, creating an arc that defies the typical straight lines and natural features that define most territorial divisions across the United States. The circular boundary originated in 1681 through King Charles II's colonial decision-making process. After the Duke of York achieved victory against Dutch colonists, the king needed to accommodate territorial arrangements that would satisfy multiple competing interests. When the Duke later transferred these lands to William Penn, the circular border became a permanent fixture of American geography, representing one of the most mathematically precise boundaries ever established in colonial America. The 2025 survey, utilizing advanced laser technology, has confirmed the remarkable precision of this 17th-century boundary work. Modern surveying equipment can measure distances and angles to within millimeters, yet the colonial surveyors managed to create a circle that remains geometrically sound after more than 3 centuries. This technological confirmation has validated the extraordinary skill of early American surveyors working with primitive tools. Legal disputes with neighboring states continue stemming from this unusual boundary configuration. Pennsylvania and Maryland both contest various aspects of how the circular border affects property rights, taxation authority, and jurisdictional questions. These disagreements create ongoing litigation that requires courts to interpret 17th-century boundary decisions using 21st-century legal frameworks. Water rights battles have intensified due to Delaware's circular territorial claim. The state asserts jurisdiction over the entire Delaware River based on its colonial charter, creating conflicts with New Jersey over navigation rights, fishing regulations, and environmental oversight. The Supreme Court has attempted to resolve these disputes, but the circular boundary continues generating new legal challenges. Property disputes occur regularly, where the circular border creates unusual lot configurations. Homeowners sometimes discover their properties extend across the curved state line, creating complications for taxation, voting rights, and municipal services. The geometric border affects local governance by requiring coordination between Delaware and Pennsylvania authorities for services along the boundary. King Charles II's decision to create this geometric boundary reflected colonial power dynamics that prioritized political convenience over geographic logic. This 17th-century geometry continues shaping 21st-century legal battles, proving that colonial decisions can create lasting complications. But while Delaware's circular border represents intentional colonial planning, other American territories exist in complete isolation due to natural forces that continue reshaping the landscape. Kentucky's impossible peninsula. Kentucky Bend represents one of America's most isolated territorial oddities, completely cut off from the rest of Kentucky by the meandering Mississippi River. This geographic anomaly sits entirely surrounded by Missouri and Tennessee, creating a situation where Kentucky residents cannot reach their own state without crossing through 2 other states first. The Oxbow Bend Formation occurred when the Mississippi River changed course over time, leaving this small piece of Kentucky territory stranded on the wrong side of the water. The river now forms a complete barrier between Kentucky Bend and the rest of the Bluegrass State, making it impossible for residents to travel directly to Kentucky proper by any land route. The 2020 census reveals just 9 permanent residents call this geographic oddity home, representing one of the smallest populated areas in the entire United States. This tiny population reflects the extreme challenges of living in such an isolated location. The residents who remain face unique circumstances that no other Americans experience. Residents must travel through Missouri and Tennessee to reach the rest of Kentucky, transforming simple trips to state government offices or Kentucky businesses into complex interstate journeys. A drive to the Kentucky state capitol requires crossing multiple state lines and traveling hundreds of miles through foreign territory just to reach their own state government. Emergency services struggle significantly to provide adequate coverage to this isolated area. Ambulances, fire trucks, and police must coordinate across state lines to reach Kentucky Bend residents, creating potential delays during critical situations. The jurisdictional complications make emergency response planning extremely complex. The Mississippi River's continued movement poses an existential threat to Kentucky Bend's survival. River engineers predict that natural channel changes could eliminate this exclave entirely by altering water flow patterns. The dynamic nature of the Mississippi means this geographic feature faces constant erosion pressure that could erase it completely within decades. Residents experience cultural identity challenges living as Kentuckians while surrounded by Tennessee and Missouri communities. Their mailing addresses show Tennessee. Their nearest services come from Missouri. Yet they remain Kentucky citizens with voting rights and legal obligations to a state they can barely reach. Mark Twain referenced this peculiar bend in life on the Mississippi, cementing its place in American folklore. This river-created anomaly demonstrates how natural forces continue reshaping territorial boundaries, sometimes creating situations that challenge basic assumptions about state sovereignty and geographic logic. But while rivers create some territorial complications through natural processes, other boundary disputes emerged from deliberate political decisions that seemed reasonable at the time yet created lasting consequences. The border war that shaped the Midwest. The Toledo War stands as one of America's most absurdly named conflicts, fought between Michigan and Ohio in 1835 over a strip of land that would determine which state controlled the strategically important city of Toledo. This territorial dispute escalated to the point where both states mobilized militias, though the actual combat remained limited to minor skirmishes and political posturing. President Andrew Jackson orchestrated a bizarre land trade to resolve the conflict, giving Ohio the coveted Toledo Strip while compensating Michigan with the Upper Peninsula. At the time, this arrangement seemed heavily weighted in Ohio's favor, as the Upper Peninsula appeared to be nothing more than frozen wilderness filled with rocks and trees. Michigan officials protested vigorously, viewing the trade as grossly unfair compensation for losing Toledo's economic advantages. The 2025 economic analysis reveals that Michigan received the better end of this territorial bargain by an enormous margin. The Upper Peninsula's mineral wealth has generated an estimated $847 billion since 1836, transforming what appeared to be worthless wilderness into one of America's most valuable resource regions. Iron ore, copper, and timber extraction created industrial fortunes that far exceeded anything Toledo could have provided. Ohio's Toledo Strip has significantly underperformed economically compared to Michigan's Upper Peninsula compensation. While Toledo developed into a modest industrial center, its economic contribution pales beside the massive wealth extracted from Michigan's Northern Territory. The port city provided steady but unremarkable growth, never approaching the explosive resource wealth that Michigan gained. This territorial swap dramatically affected population distribution patterns throughout both states, with effects still visible in 2025 demographic data. The Upper Peninsula developed as a distinct region with unique economic drivers, while Ohio's northern border remained relatively conventional. Michigan's population became split between two geographically separate regions with different economic foundations. Cultural differences between the Upper and Lower Peninsulas persist as lasting consequences of the 1835 Compromise. Upper Peninsula residents often identify more strongly with their regional identity than with Michigan as a whole, developing distinct traditions based on mining, logging, and outdoor recreation that differ markedly from the automotive culture of southern Michigan. Modern transportation finally connected these distant Michigan territories when the Mackinac Bridge opened in 1957, creating the physical link that the Territorial Compromise had made necessary. Climate change has made the Upper Peninsula increasingly valuable as a refuge from rising temperatures, proving that this 19th-century compromise continues shaping regional economics in unexpected ways. But Michigan's geographic separation represents just one example of how American communities can find themselves isolated from their own states by geographic barriers that require creative solutions for daily life. How geographic positioning can transform a Vermont town into something resembling a Canadian community. This Vermont community sits on a peninsula that juts northward into Lake Champlain, creating a situation where the most practical route to anywhere else requires crossing international boundaries first. The peninsula extends deep into Lake Champlain waters, effectively cutting Alberg off from convenient land access to the rest of Vermont. This geographic isolation means residents face a choice between lengthy detours through Vermont territory or simple border crossings into Canada for most of their daily travel needs. The lake's configuration has shaped every aspect of how this community functions. The 2025 population count shows 2,165 residents calling this border anomaly home, representing a stable community that has adapted to the unique circumstances of international proximity. These residents have built their lives around the realities of geographic isolation, developing systems and relationships that span national boundaries out of practical necessity. Alberg's economy operates through heavy dependence on cross-border commerce, with local businesses serving customers from both countries. Shops, restaurants, and service providers have established customer bases that include Americans and Canadians, creating revenue streams that cross international lines. This economic integration has become essential for the town's financial survival. Special border crossing arrangements have developed over decades to accommodate residents' daily needs. These procedures recognize the unique circumstances facing Alberg residents who must cross international boundaries for routine activities like shopping, medical appointments, and employment. The arrangements reflect ongoing cooperation between American and Canadian border authorities. Seasonal lake freezing creates temporary land connections that link Alberg directly to Vermont during winter months. Ice roads form across the frozen lake surface, providing alternative routes that bypass international border crossings entirely. These seasonal connections change how residents move around depending on weather conditions. Educational arrangements accommodate students who cross international borders daily for school attendance. Emergency services coordinate across international boundaries to provide comprehensive coverage, with fire departments, medical services, and law enforcement agencies working together to ensure rapid response times. The cultural atmosphere blends American and Canadian influences throughout daily life, creating traditions that reflect both national identities. This binational community has evolved into a truly integrated cross-border society, where international cooperation defines local character. But while Alberg represents cross-border cooperation at its finest, other American landmarks face ownership disputes that create far more complex jurisdictional challenges. Ellis Island's bizarre dual ownership. Ellis Island stands as America's most famous immigration station, where over 12 million immigrants first set foot on American soil between 1892 and 1954. This historic landmark occupies a unique position in American geography, functioning as the only location in the United States that belongs simultaneously to both New York and New Jersey. The dual ownership creates a jurisdictional situation unlike anywhere else in America, where two states share complete authority over a single piece of territory. The island operates under joint ownership arrangements that have persisted for more than a century, with New York controlling the original island while New Jersey maintains authority over the artificially expanded portions. This division stems from colonial-era agreements and subsequent legal settlements that recognized both states' historical claims to the territory. The arrangement requires constant coordination between two separate state governments for virtually every operational decision. The 2025 Supreme Court reaffirmation solidified this complex ownership structure through recent decisions that clarified jurisdictional boundaries while maintaining the dual authority system. These rulings consistently affirmed the unique arrangement, underscoring the enduring nature of shared jurisdiction and establishing precedents for future governance decisions. The court's involvement demonstrates the ongoing legal complexities that continue requiring federal oversight. Artificial landfill expansion dramatically complicated state boundaries by adding territory that blurred the lines between New York and New Jersey control. The land reclamation projects that expanded Ellis Island's footprint created new legal questions about which state held authority over the enlarged sections. These boundary modifications continue generating disputes over territorial control and resource allocation. Tourism revenue and maintenance costs create ongoing disputes between both states as they negotiate the financial responsibilities of operating this major tourist destination. The millions of annual visitors generate substantial revenue that both states claim, while the significant maintenance expenses require coordination between separate budgeting processes and administrative systems. Law enforcement jurisdiction divides between New York and New Jersey police authorities, creating operational challenges that require constant coordination for security and public safety. The National Park Service navigates dual state oversight by balancing competing interests while preserving historical significance, coordinating with both state governments while maintaining federal standards. This immigration symbol represents the enduring complexity of American federalism, demonstrating how shared governance creates administrative challenges that persist across centuries. But while Ellis Island's boundaries remain fixed despite dual ownership, other states face territorial complications that change constantly based on natural forces beyond human control. Maryland's shape-shifting borders. Maryland's shape defies every expectation of what a state should look like, with an irregular coastline that creates one of America's most complex territorial configurations. The state's boundaries twist and curve through waterways, creating a geographic puzzle that challenges even experienced cartographers. This intricate coastline extends deep into the Chesapeake Bay system, forming numerous peninsulas, inlets, and islands that make Maryland's exact shape nearly impossible to define with precision. Tidal variations literally change Maryland's size every single day, creating a state that expands and contracts with oceanic rhythms. High tide brings water levels that submerge land areas considered part of the state during low tide periods. This daily transformation means Maryland's actual territorial extent fluctuates constantly, making it the only state whose size changes predictably based on natural water cycles. The measurements reveal Maryland's area fluctuates by hundreds of square miles between high and low tide periods. This massive variation demonstrates the enormous impact that tidal movements have on state territory. These calculations required sophisticated monitoring systems that track water levels across hundreds of measurement points throughout the Chesapeake Bay system and Atlantic coastline. The Potomac River's low water mark defines the Virginia border, creating a boundary that shifts based on rainfall, drought conditions, and seasonal water variations. This means the precise location where Maryland ends and Virginia begins changes constantly depending on environmental factors beyond human control. Property owners along the river face uncertainty about which state holds jurisdiction over their land at any given moment. Climate change has begun permanently altering these tidal boundaries through rising sea levels and changing precipitation patterns. Areas that historically remained above water during high tide now experience regular flooding, effectively transferring territory from land to water. These changes create new legal questions about property ownership and state jurisdiction that existing laws never anticipated. Legal complications multiply as constantly shifting borders create property rights disputes between landowners and state authorities. Courts must determine ownership based on boundary locations that existed at specific times, requiring extensive documentation and survey work to establish historical water levels and territorial claims. Watermen navigate complex jurisdictional waters where fishing regulations, licensing requirements, and enforcement authority change based on tidal conditions and precise geographic location. Maryland represents the ultimate challenge of defining stable boundaries in a dynamic environment. But some states face even more dramatic territorial complications created by deliberate political decisions that carved unusual shapes into the American landscape. West Virginia's double Panhandle puzzle. West Virginia displays one of America's most peculiar state shapes, featuring two distinct panhandles that stretch in completely opposite directions like geographic arms reaching toward different neighbors. These unusual territorial extensions create a configuration that makes West Virginia appear almost like a backwards letter T when viewed on any map. The eastern panhandle extends toward Washington, D.C. and Maryland, while the northern panhandle reaches up between Ohio and Pennsylvania, creating a state design that defies conventional geographic logic. These geographic protrusions emerged directly from Civil War politics, when Western Virginia counties chose to remain loyal to the Union rather than join the Confederacy. The 1863 formation of West Virginia required drawing boundaries that included these Union-supporting communities, regardless of whether the resulting shape made practical sense. Military necessity and political allegiance determined these borders, rather than geographic convenience or administrative efficiency. The 2025 population distribution reveals that approximately 89% of West Virginia residents live outside both panhandles, concentrating in the main body of the state. This demographic reality means the panhandles function almost as separate entities, with distinct economic conditions and cultural identities that often differ dramatically from the rest of West Virginia. The Eastern Panhandle has transformed into a Washington, D.C. suburban extension, attracting commuters who work in the capital region but seek more affordable housing options. This development has brought economic growth and population increases that contrast sharply with conditions elsewhere in the state. The proximity to federal employment centers has created a unique economic zone within West Virginia. The northern panhandle faces opposite challenges, experiencing industrial decline and steady population loss as traditional manufacturing jobs have disappeared. This region struggles with economic diversification while dealing with aging infrastructure and shrinking tax bases that limit development opportunities. These extensions create governance challenges that require state officials to address needs of geographically separated regions with different economic priorities and cultural perspectives. Transportation infrastructure struggles to connect these distant areas effectively, with mountainous terrain making highway construction expensive and complicated. Political tensions emerge regularly between regions as they compete for state resources and representation. The panhandles often feel disconnected from state government decisions made in Charleston, creating ongoing friction over resource allocation and policy priorities. These Civil War-era boundaries continue shaping modern West Virginia politics and identity, but other states feature territorial extensions that create even more dramatic isolation from their main territories. Oklahoma's Olfand Panhandle. Oklahoma's distinctive rectangular panhandle extends westward like a geographic afterthought, creating one of America's most unusual state shapes. This narrow strip of land measures exactly 34 miles wide and 166 miles long, forming a perfect rectangle that appears almost artificial when viewed on any map. The panhandle's geometric precision stands in stark contrast to the irregular boundaries that define most American states. This region operated as no man's land for decades, existing without any formal government structure from 1850 to 1890. During this lawless period, the territory attracted outlaws, cattle rustlers, and settlers seeking to escape legal authority. The absence of organized law enforcement created a frontier atmosphere where residents developed self-reliance and independence that continues characterizing the area today. The 2025 agricultural statistics reveal that Oklahoma's panhandle produces an astounding 34% of the state's total wheat output, despite representing only a small fraction of Oklahoma's land area. This agricultural productivity demonstrates the region's crucial role in state economics and food production. The Panhandle's farming operations have achieved remarkable efficiency through advanced irrigation systems and drought-resistant crop varieties that have transformed this former wasteland into America's breadbasket. Weather patterns in the Panhandle create both exceptional productivity and constant danger for farming operations. The area experiences extreme temperature variations, from scorching summers exceeding 100 degrees to bitter winters with sub-zero temperatures. Frequent droughts, devastating hailstorms, and occasional tornadoes pose constant threats to crops and livestock. The Panhandle's geographic isolation has preserved distinct cultural traditions that differ markedly from the rest of Oklahoma. Local customs, dialect, and social practices reflect the region's unique history and frontier heritage. Community events celebrate cattle ranching traditions and agricultural achievements that define local identity. Population decline continues affecting the Panhandle despite its agricultural importance. Young people migrate to urban areas seeking better economic opportunities, leaving behind aging communities with shrinking populations. Climate change has begun affecting farming viability through altered precipitation patterns and increased frequency of extreme weather events. The Panhandle faces significant political underrepresentation due to its small population and remote location. This former lawless territory now struggles to maintain adequate political representation while continuing to feed much of America. But Oklahoma's rectangular extension represents just one example of how American states feature geographic appendages that operate almost independently from their parent territories. Idaho's northern neck. Idaho's northern panhandle creates one of America's most bizarre state configurations, extending upward like a geographic finger that barely maintains connection to the rest of Idaho. This narrow strip of territory stretches northward between Washington and Montana, creating a shape that defies conventional state design and challenges basic assumptions about territorial organization. The Panhandle measures just 45 miles wide at its narrowest point near the Washington border, creating a bottleneck that makes this region feel almost detached from the main body of Idaho. This constricted connection means the Northern Territory operates with limited physical ties to southern Idaho, forcing residents to develop distinct regional characteristics and economic relationships. The 2025 economic data reveals the Panhandle's overwhelming dependence on Washington state rather than Idaho for commerce and employment. Cross-border economic activity generates the majority of regional income, with residents commuting to Washington jobs and conducting business primarily with Spokane-area companies. This economic orientation creates financial flows that bypass Idaho entirely, making the Panhandle function more like a Washington suburb than an Idaho region. Residents consistently identify more strongly with Spokane than with Boise, reflecting the practical realities of daily life in this geographically isolated area. Spokane sits just across the state line, offering shopping, entertainment, healthcare, and employment opportunities that far exceed anything available in distant Idaho cities. This cultural affiliation has created a population that thinks and acts more like Pacific Northwest residents than traditional Idahoans. Time zone complications add another layer of separation between the Panhandle and the rest of Idaho. The region observes Pacific time while southern Idaho uses Mountain time, creating scheduling difficulties and communication problems that reinforce the area's distinct identity. Business operations must coordinate across time zones just to communicate within their own state. The mountainous terrain effectively isolates this region from southern Idaho through physical barriers that make transportation difficult and expensive. The Bitterroot, Cabinet, and Coeur d'Alene Mountains create formidable obstacles that limit connectivity and encourage residents to look westward toward Washington for their needs. Tourism has become increasingly vital as visitors discover the Panhandle's natural beauty and recreational opportunities. The influx of tourists supports local businesses while creating new revenue streams beyond traditional logging operations. Ongoing discussions about regional autonomy reflect residents' desire for greater local control over governance decisions that affect their unique circumstances. The Panhandle operates almost as a separate state entity, demonstrating how geographic barriers can create boundaries that transcend official political lines. But while human-drawn borders create some territorial complications, natural forces shape even more fundamental divisions that determine how water flows across the entire continent. The Continental Divide's crazy routes. The Continental Divide cuts across America in ways that would surprise most geography students. following a path that ignores state boundaries and creates invisible watersheds that determine where every drop of rain eventually flows. Water falling on one side of this boundary heads toward the Atlantic Ocean, while precipitation landing just feet away flows toward the Pacific. This invisible line shapes water distribution across the entire continent. Yet most Americans have no idea where it actually runs. Water flow direction serves as the sole determining factor for this boundary, creating a natural division that exists independently of human political decisions. The divide follows ridgelines, mountain peaks, and elevated terrain where water naturally separates into different drainage basins. Unlike state boundaries marked by surveys and treaties, the Continental Divide represents a purely natural phenomenon that responds only to topography and gravity. The 2025 mapping updates have refined the divide's exact location using advanced GPS technology and satellite imagery that reveals previously unknown details about watershed boundaries. These sophisticated measurements show the divide's position with accuracy measured in feet rather than miles, exposing areas where earlier surveys contained significant errors. The updated mapping has identified sections where the divide follows routes that differ substantially from previous assumptions. Climate change has begun actually shifting watershed boundaries through altered precipitation patterns and changing snowmelt cycles that affect water flow directions. Melting glaciers and changing weather systems modify how water moves across the landscape, causing the divide's location to shift gradually over time. These environmental changes create new drainage patterns that redefine where the Continental Divide actually runs. The divide splits into multiple paths in several locations, creating complex drainage systems where water can flow in 3 different directions from a single point. These triple divides represent unique geographic features where watersheds separate toward the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans simultaneously. Human activities have artificially altered natural water flow through dam construction, irrigation projects, and urban development that redirects precipitation away from natural drainage patterns. These modifications create artificial watersheds that don't follow the natural Continental Divide, complicating boundary definitions and creating legal disputes over water rights as watershed boundaries shift and affect land ownership. Ongoing scientific monitoring tracks this dynamic boundary using hydrological sensors and mapping technology that provides continuous data about watershed changes. This natural boundary continues evolving with environmental changes, but the Continental Divide represents just one example of how America's geographic understanding keeps expanding through technological advances that reveal features previously hidden from view. America's brand new geographic discoveries. Satellite technology and geological surveys continue uncovering geographic features that somehow escaped detection until now. America continues discovering new territories, waterways, and landforms in 2025, challenging the assumption that our nation's map reached completion decades ago. Advanced technology keeps revealing locations that somehow avoided previous documentation, proving that even in the digital age, geographic surprises await discovery across American landscapes. Advanced satellite imagery revealed 847 previously unknown lakes throughout the United States during 2024, representing one of the most significant geographic discoveries in recent history. These bodies of water had remained hidden due to their remote locations, seasonal variations, or coverage by vegetation that obscured them from traditional surveying methods. The lakes range from small mountain tarns to substantial reservoirs that somehow avoided official documentation despite their considerable size. Underground river systems discovered through sophisticated geological surveys are creating unexpected complications for state boundary definitions. These subterranean waterways flow beneath established political boundaries, raising questions about water rights, mineral extraction permissions, and jurisdictional authority. Some underground rivers cross multiple state lines, potentially affecting legal agreements that assumed surface features determined territorial control. Melting permafrost across Alaska has exposed geographic features that remained frozen and hidden for thawns of years. The thawing ground reveals ancient lake beds, river channels, and geological formations that add new complexity to Alaska's already challenging geography. These discoveries include previously unknown valleys, rock formations, and even evidence of prehistoric water systems that reshape understanding of Alaska's geographic development. Artificial islands constructed for various industrial and military purposes have created new territorial claims that complicate maritime boundaries. These man-made landforms raise legal questions about sovereignty, territorial waters, and resource rights that existing maritime law never anticipated. The islands generate economic value while challenging traditional concepts of natural versus artificial territory. Sea level rise simultaneously creates new islands while eliminating others, fundamentally altering America's coastal geography. Rising waters expose previously submerged rocks and reefs, while drowning existing small islands and coastal features. These changes force constant updates to navigation charts and boundary definitions, as the coastline literally reshapes itself. GPS technology continues refining understanding of existing boundaries by providing measurements accurate to inches rather than feet. These precise calculations reveal errors in historical surveys and expose boundary disputes that remained hidden for generations. Environmental implications include ecosystem disruptions, habitat changes, and resource management challenges as new geographic features alter local environments and wildlife patterns. These discoveries demonstrate that America's territorial boundaries face pressures from forces both natural and technological. State boundaries that changed this decade. While technological advances reveal new geographic features, political boundaries face their own transformations through forces both natural and legal. Most Americans assume state boundaries remain permanently fixed once established, representing unchanging lines that define territorial authority for generations. These borders appear as solid lines on maps, creating the impression that state divisions were settled long ago and will never require modification. The reality proves far more complex, as natural forces constantly reshape the geographic features that define many state boundaries. River channel changes have required multiple boundary adjustments since 2020, forcing states to acknowledge that nature doesn't respect political decisions. Rivers naturally meander over time, creating new channels while abandoning old ones. These shifts can transfer territory from one state to another, affecting property ownership, taxation authority, and jurisdictional control. The changes occur gradually but persistently, requiring constant monitoring and occasional official boundary modifications. The 2023 Missouri-Kansas boundary modification exemplifies how river meandering creates practical problems requiring legal solutions. The Missouri River shifted course significantly enough to necessitate an official boundary adjustment between the two states. This modification required extensive surveying, legal documentation, and administrative coordination to ensure both states agreed on the new territorial arrangement. The process took months to complete and affected property owners along the shifted boundary. The Supreme Court has ruled on several recent boundary disputes, establishing precedents for how states must handle natural boundary changes. These decisions recognize that rivers naturally move over time, and that states cannot ignore geographic reality simply to maintain convenience. The court's rulings provide frameworks for resolving future disputes, while acknowledging the ongoing challenges posed by dynamic natural boundaries. Texas and Oklahoma continue negotiating Red River boundary issues that have persisted for decades. The river's shifting course creates constant complications for property ownership, resource rights, and state authority. These negotiations involve complex legal questions about historical boundaries versus current geographic conditions, requiring careful balance between legal precedent and practical reality. Climate-induced geographic changes are forcing boundary reviews across multiple states as environmental shifts alter natural features that define territorial limits. The bureaucratic process for officially changing state lines involves multiple agencies, extensive documentation, and careful legal review. These boundary changes affect residents' state citizenship, voting rights, and tax obligations, with people discovering they now live in different states without moving. Modern surveying technology tracks boundary movements with unprecedented precision, enabling accurate documentation of natural changes. But while state boundaries create confusion through natural forces, administrative divisions within states present their own geometric puzzles with that challenge basic assumptions about rational America's governance. County system includes some of the most bizarrely shaped administrative divisions you'll find anywhere in the world. These irregular boundaries create administrative nightmares that would challenge even the most experienced government officials. The strange configurations result from historical accidents, political compromises, and geographic features that made sense centuries ago but create chaos for modern governance. Historical decisions made without considering long-term consequences created counties that defy basic logic and efficient administration. Colonial land grants, treaty negotiations, and territorial disputes established boundaries based on temporary political needs rather than practical governance requirements. These 18th and 19th century choices continue affecting millions of Americans who must navigate the resulting administrative confusion. Virginia's Fairfax County exemplifies the problems created by irregular county shapes through its intricate protrusions and bizarre indentations that make service delivery nearly impossible to coordinate efficiently. The county's boundaries include strange extensions that reach into neighboring jurisdictions, while creating holes and gaps that complicate everything from mail delivery to emergency response. These irregular borders create confusion among residents who struggle to understand which government entity provides specific services to their exact location. Los Angeles County's massive size and complex shape present governance challenges that make efficient resource management virtually impossible across its vast territory. The county covers over 4,000 square miles with boundaries that create logistical nightmares for law enforcement, emergency services, and public administration. Response times suffer dramatically in remote sections of the county, while resource allocation becomes a constant struggle between urban and rural areas with completely different needs. Several American counties exist as multiple disconnected pieces, forcing residents to travel through other jurisdictions just to access basic government services or participate in local elections. These fragmented administrative divisions create situations where county residents cannot reach their county courthouse without crossing through entirely different governmental territories. These odd shapes significantly affect elections and emergency services by creating districts that make fair representation nearly impossible while complicating response coordination. Multiple attempts to rationalize county boundaries have failed due to political resistance and the enormous complexity of redrawing established administrative lines. The economic inefficiencies created by poorly designed county boundaries continue complicating 21st century governance through 18th century decisions that prioritized temporary political convenience over long-term administrative efficiency. But geographic boundaries aren't the only invisible lines that create daily confusion for Americans trying to navigate their own country. Time zone madness across America. Time zones create their own invisible boundaries that fragment American communities in ways that geographic features never could. The country operates under 6 different time zones, but the real complexity emerges when individual counties can choose which time zone to follow. This local control creates situations where neighboring communities just miles apart operate under completely different time systems. County-level time zone decisions produce bizarre circumstances that defy geographic logic. Indiana exemplifies this temporal chaos, where counties can petition to switch time zones based on economic considerations rather than solar positioning. The state's complex history with time zones has created a checkerboard pattern where adjacent counties observe different times, forcing residents to constantly adjust their schedules based on their destination. Several Indiana counties have changed time zones multiple times since 2020, creating administrative nightmares for residents who must adapt to new temporal realities. These changes affect everything from work schedules to school districts, with some counties switching back and forth as local officials weigh economic benefits against practical complications. The frequent changes have left residents confused about which time zone they actually observe. Businesses operating across time zone boundaries face constant operational challenges that increase costs and reduce efficiency. Companies must coordinate schedules, deliveries, and communications across invisible lines that create temporal divisions. Manufacturing facilities near time zone borders struggle with shift changes, while retail operations must adjust store hours to accommodate customers from different time zones. Health impacts affect residents living near time zone borders who experience disrupted circadian rhythms and sleep patterns. Medical research shows that people living within 15 miles of time zone boundaries suffer higher rates of sleep disorders and related health problems. The constant temporal adjustments required for work, school, and social activities create chronic stress that affects physical and mental well-being. Digital technology has amplified time zone confusion by creating scheduling conflicts in online meetings, automated systems, and digital communications. Software applications often struggle to handle multiple time zones correctly, leading to missed appointments and coordination failures. Schools face unique challenges when students live in different time zones, requiring complex scheduling arrangements for transportation, activities, and communication with parents. Some districts operate buses that cross time zone boundaries twice daily, creating logistical puzzles that would challenge any transportation coordinator. These temporal boundaries represent just one type of invisible line that shapes American geography, but other boundary markers face even more fundamental challenges as the natural features that once defined territorial limits begin disappearing entirely. Nature's bizarre state boundaries. Rivers, mountains, and lakes once provided the obvious markers for drawing territorial lines across America. State boundaries originally relied on natural features that seemed permanent and unchanging, creating territorial divisions based on distinctive landmarks that early surveyors assumed would endure forever. These natural markers provided clear reference points that made sense to colonial administrators who needed visible boundaries between different jurisdictions. Dried lakes and vanished rivers continue defining state lines despite their complete disappearance from the modern landscape. Ancient lake beds that dried up decades ago still serve as official boundaries between states, creating invisible lines that cross empty terrain. Rivers that changed course or disappeared entirely through drought and environmental changes maintain their legal status as territorial dividers, forcing surveyors to locate boundaries through historical records rather than current geographic features. The Colorado-Utah boundary exemplifies how river movement creates ongoing territorial complications. Originally defined by the Colorado River's course several decades ago, the boundary now follows a path where the river no longer flows. The river shifted significantly eastward, leaving the official state line marking an empty channel that visitors cannot see or identify. Officials must determine the exact location of the original riverbed to maintain accurate territorial definitions, requiring extensive historical research and sophisticated surveying techniques. Forest fires have eliminated thousands of trees that once marked state boundaries across Western America. These landmark trees served as surveying reference points for over a century, with specific species and individual specimens identified in official boundary descriptions. The destruction of these natural markers through wildfires has created gaps in boundary identification that require modern technology to fill. Mountain peaks have eroded away while continuing to define territorial limits, according to legal documents that reference their former positions. Geological processes gradually wear down distinctive peaks that early surveyors used as boundary markers, leaving legal descriptions that point to geographic features that no longer exist in recognizable form. Climate change accelerates the obsolescence of natural boundaries through environmental shifts that eliminate the natural landmarks once providing clear territorial references. Surveying challenges multiply when missing natural landmarks force officials to reconstruct historical boundaries using incomplete records and educated guesswork. GPS coordinates increasingly replace natural boundary markers, providing precise territorial definitions that remain accurate regardless of environmental changes. But even as land-based boundaries shift from natural features to artificial coordinate systems, America's territorial claims extend far beyond visible shorelines into waters where boundaries become even more complex and contentious. America's underwater border wars. Maritime territorial claims create jurisdictional battles that dwarf any land-based boundary dispute in complexity and economic stakes. States assert territorial control over waters extending 12 nautical miles from their shorelines, while also claiming rights to resources on the continental shelf that can extend much further offshore. These underwater borders define where state authority ends and federal jurisdiction begins, but the lines remain completely hidden beneath the surface. States claim territorial waters beyond their shorelines based on historical agreements and federal laws that grant them authority over fishing, mineral rights, and environmental regulation within designated zones. These claims create overlapping jurisdictions where multiple states assert authority over the same underwater territories. The competition for control stems from the enormous economic value hidden beneath these waters, including oil deposits, natural gas reserves, and valuable fishing grounds that generate billions in annual revenue. Ongoing disputes between states over offshore resources have intensified as technology makes previously inaccessible underwater wealth economically viable to extract. Florida and Alabama continue battling over Gulf of Mexico boundaries that contain substantial oil and gas deposits worth billions of dollars. California disputes with federal authorities over offshore wind energy development rights, while East Coast states argue over fishing territories that have supported local economies for centuries. Sea level rise significantly affects maritime boundary calculations by altering the baseline measurements used to determine territorial water limits. Rising ocean levels submerge coastal reference points that surveyors have used for decades to establish boundary starting points. These changes force constant recalculation of territorial limits, potentially transferring underwater territories between different jurisdictions as coastlines shift inland. Billions of dollars remain at stake in offshore boundary disputes that affect energy exploration, commercial fishing, and mineral extraction rights. The Gulf of Mexico contains an estimated $2.4 trillion in untapped oil and gas reserves, while Atlantic offshore wind development represents a potential $70 billion industry. These economic incentives drive fierce legal battles between states seeking to maximize their territorial claims. Federal and state maritime jurisdictions create overlapping authority that generates confusion about which government controls specific underwater areas. The federal government maintains primary control over international waters, while states typically govern waters within 3 nautical miles of their coasts. These competing claims create enforcement challenges for the Coast Guard and state marine patrol units. Advanced sonar technology and satellite monitoring systems help map and enforce these invisible boundaries, but America's maritime borders continue generating increasing tension as resource competition intensifies. These underwater territorial disputes represent just one layer of jurisdictional complexity that shapes American geography, but other boundary systems create even more intricate patterns of overlapping authority. Tribal territories' complex reality. Native American reservations operate under the most complex territorial system in America, where sovereignty creates jurisdictional puzzles that make standard boundary disputes seem simple by comparison. Most Americans assume tribal boundaries represent clear lines separating Native American territories from surrounding areas, but this misconception ignores the extraordinarily complex reality of tribal sovereignty that challenges basic assumptions about territorial authority. Tribal sovereignty creates jurisdictional situations where multiple authorities claim overlapping control over identical geographic areas. Native American tribes function as sovereign entities with inherent rights to self-governance, but this sovereignty operates within federal oversight that limits tribal authority in specific circumstances. The resulting system produces territorial puzzles where tribal police, state law enforcement, and federal agencies all maintain different levels of authority over the same territories. The 2025 Supreme Court decisions have significantly expanded tribal territorial authority through rulings that strengthen Native American jurisdiction over non-members conducting activities on tribal lands. These decisions affect resource management, regulatory authority, and law enforcement capabilities, fundamentally altering the balance of power between tribal governments and surrounding jurisdictions. The court's recent interpretations of treaties and federal statutes have created new precedents that increase tribal control over territorial boundaries. Reservation boundaries frequently conflict with state and county lines, creating administrative complications that affect taxation, service delivery, and legal jurisdiction. These boundary conflicts force residents to navigate multiple governmental systems depending on their precise location, with different rules applying just yards apart. The overlapping jurisdictions complicate everything from emergency response to business licensing requirements. The checkerboard pattern of land ownership on many reservations creates particularly challenging governance situations. This fragmented ownership structure results from historical policies like the Dawes Act, which divided tribal lands into individual allotments interspersed with non-tribal properties. The checkerboard pattern hinders economic development, complicates resource management, and creates enforcement challenges for tribal authorities. Ongoing land disputes between tribes and surrounding governments stem from conflicting claims over resource rights and territorial control. These disputes involve complex legal battles that require careful balancing of competing interests while considering historical treaties and legal precedents. Federal recognition remains crucial for tribal territorial claims, determining which communities receive specific rights, including land ownership and self-governance authority. Tribal territories represent a unique form of American geography where cultural identity intersects with complex governmental relationships, but these human-created boundary systems pale beside the forces that shape territorial divisions through environmental patterns completely beyond political control. Climate zones that ignore state lines. Weather systems create environmental divisions that completely disregard the neat lines politicians drew centuries ago. Climate operates independently of human political decisions, creating environmental zones that cross state boundaries without regard for territorial authority or administrative convenience. Temperature ranges and precipitation levels follow natural laws that ignore the artificial lines drawn on maps by surveyors, creating situations where single states experience dramatically different climate conditions across their territories. Individual states contain multiple distinct climate zones that create vastly different living conditions within the same political territory. California exemplifies this phenomenon by encompassing Mediterranean coastal regions, desert environments, alpine mountain conditions, and temperate valleys all within a single state boundary. Texas similarly spans humid subtropical zones in the east, arid desert conditions in the west, and semi-arid climates throughout central regions, creating environmental diversity that challenges unified state policy development. The 2025 climate data reveals zones shifting across state lines at unprecedented rates, with traditional climate boundaries moving northward at speeds that surprise meteorologists and environmental scientists. These shifts affect established agricultural regions, urban planning assumptions, and infrastructure designed for specific climate conditions that no longer exist in many areas. Temperature zones advance northward at rates exceeding 2 miles per year in some regions. Agricultural zones demonstrate the most visible impacts of this northward movement as warming temperatures extend growing seasons and alter crop viability across traditional farming regions. Iowa and Nebraska now support crops previously unsuitable for their climate conditions, while traditional growing regions in southern states face challenges from excessive heat and changing precipitation patterns. Farmers throughout the Midwest report growing seasons extending by 3 to 4 weeks compared to conditions just a decade ago. The Southwest experiences the most dramatic climate zone changes, with states like Arizona and Nevada facing intensified heat waves and extended drought periods that strain infrastructure and public health systems. Meanwhile, Northeastern states encounter milder winters that disrupt established ecosystems and affect seasonal industries dependent on predictable weather patterns. These environmental shifts affect insurance rates as companies reassess risk calculations based on changing climate conditions. Areas previously considered low risk now experience increased extreme weather events, forcing insurance companies to raise premiums or withdraw coverage entirely from high-risk zones. Legal implications emerge as states must update building codes, zoning regulations, and environmental policies to address climate conditions that differ from historical norms. Climate change continues redrawing America's environmental map at accelerating speeds, creating new challenges that dwarf the boundary complications we've explored. These natural forces represent just the beginning of geographic transformations that will reshape American territories in ways that make current disputes seem minor by comparison. America's geographic future. Looking ahead reveals transformations that will dwarf anything we've examined so far. America's geography will continue changing dramatically over the next decade, driven by forces that make current boundary disputes seem simple by comparison. The assumption that our national map reached its final form decades ago ignores the powerful environmental and technological forces already reshaping territorial reality across the United States. Sea level rise will eliminate some coastal territories while simultaneously creating others through complex processes that challenge traditional concepts of permanent boundaries. The national, oceanic, and atmospheric administration tracks see surface temperature increases of approximately 3 degrees Celsius above normal conditions, accelerating coastal erosion at unprecedented rates. These changes will submerge existing islands and coastal areas while exposing previously underwater land formations that could become new territorial claims. Projected boundary changes expected by 2030 include significant modifications along river-defined state lines as climate change accelerates natural channel movements. The Missouri-Kansas boundary modification demonstrates how states must adapt to geographic reality, but future changes will occur at much faster rates. Rivers throughout the Midwest face dramatic flow alterations that will force multiple states to renegotiate territorial agreements established centuries ago. Climate migration patterns will reshape population distribution as extreme heat events make large areas of the Southwest increasingly uninhabitable. The combination of extreme heat and humidity creates conditions that overwhelm human cooling mechanisms within hours, forcing mass population movements toward more temperate regions. These demographic shifts will alter political representation, economic centers, and infrastructure demands across multiple states. New territories requiring incorporation include artificial islands created for energy production, land exposed by retreating glaciers in Alaska, and coastal areas that emerge as sea levels redistribute existing water masses. These geographic additions will raise complex questions about statehood, territorial status, and resource ownership that existing legal frameworks cannot address. Technology will revolutionize boundary definition and management through GPS coordinate systems that replace natural landmarks with precise digital markers. Advanced monitoring systems will track geographic changes in real time, enabling immediate boundary adjustments rather than lengthy legal disputes that currently resolve territorial questions years after changes occur. Legal frameworks under development include automated boundary adjustment protocols, interstate coordination systems for geographic emergencies, and new territorial incorporation procedures designed for rapid environmental changes. International implications include potential boundary disputes with Canada and Mexico as climate change affects shared water resources and coastal territories. These unprecedented transformations continue revealing territorial mysteries that reshape our understanding of American geography daily. Geographic mysteries will continue multiplying as environmental forces accelerate changes across American territories. The 847 newly discovered lakes represent just one example of how much Americans still don't know about their own country's geography, with satellite imagery revealing hidden features while GPS systems uncover boundary errors that existed for centuries. Climate change accelerates these complications by shifting rivers, altering coastlines, and creating new land formations that challenge established territorial concepts. State boundaries continue moving as rivers change course and sea levels rise, forcing constant updates to maps that previous generations assumed were permanently fixed. America's territorial reality remains a work in progress, with new discoveries and environmental changes constantly rewriting geographic understanding across the nation. These 25 oddities demonstrate that American geography contains far more surprises than most people realize, proving that even familiar territories hold secrets waiting for discovery.